Okay, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngau mai haere mai ki tēnei wānanga ipurangi. Whakatau mai I runga ki te kaupapa o te rā. E Momo Pūnaha Wairākau. Ko Wairākau, ko Sam te tau ahau. No tikawenga raua me kaipāwe tōku tīpuna. Kei te noho au ki pahi atua, ki te tararua. Ko au te kai arahi mō Wairarapa me Papaioia me tararua. Nei rā te mihi mai oha ki a tātou katoa, e hui tahi nei I tēnei rā. E aro nei ki tā tātou kaupapa, o te rā me te hononga ki te whakatauki. Ko au, ko te whenua ko au. I am the land, and the land is me. Greetings everyone, welcome to our online wānanga, to our topic, different composting systems. My name is Sam Te Tau. I descend from Rangitāne and Ngāti Kahununu ki Wairarapa. I now live in Pahiatua in Tararua. I am the Parakuri Kaiarahi in Wairarapa, Tararua and Papaioia, Palmerston North. Warm greetings to all of us present in this hui today. As we begin our meeting, we reflect on the things that bring us together, including the insights contained in the saying, he ringa one one, he oranga tangata. Hands in the soil make for healthy people. Nō reira nā runga I tērā, me timata tātou. And so, on that, let's begin. Tuatahi me karakia timatanga. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te ata kura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. Seize the winds from the west, seize the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened ear, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Before we get into our wānanga, we will take a moment to go over the tikanga for today's hui. This event is being recorded, so you can switch your video off if you feel more comfortable doing so. You have been placed on mute by default. Please stay on mute to avoid interruption. We'll open up space for questions and answers at the end, so please put any pātai you have as they arise into the chat, and these will be recorded. Before we get into the presentation, please introduce yourself by sharing in the chat either where you're zooming in from or what rōpū organisation you are here on behalf of. And if you're already composting, what composting system do you currently have implemented? I'll give you a moment to do that. Can I please have a thumbs up if you can see my slide? the first slide of the presentation. Cool, thank you. Okay, I'll get started. Te mahi Wairākau, Compost 101. Different composting systems. Today we're going to explore the many options for food waste and green waste. There will be an introduction to some of the most common composting systems, how these work, what they produce, and which might be the best composting for your situation. Food waste is usually what is left over after meals and meal preparation in the kitchen, whereas green waste is from any other vegetable and plant waste, such as lawn clippings, hedge and tree trimmings, vegetable roots and leaves that aren't edible. Let us look at some common uses for food waste. Just give me a thumbs up if you do this option that you see on the screen. Not everyone has a composting system or is able to compost. However, there are other options for food waste, and these options still keep the nutrients in the cycle of nature. This is a good reminder that we have many options when it comes to food waste, and the best ones are where we feed these nutrients back to hini ahuone and maintain the health of Papatūānuku, including composting. So if you use your food waste to feed chooks, please just give us a thumbs up. If you use your food waste to feed pigs, please give us a thumbs up. If you already use your food waste to feed noke, to feed worms, please give me a thumbs up. And if you already use your food waste to feed Papatūānuku, and what I mean by that is just digging a hole and putting that food waste into the hole. Composting is an example of feeding the soil. It's not only fertilizing, building, and enriching soil structures, it's also creating new soil in the process. Feeding chooks, feeding pigs, worms, feeding the soil, feed nature, feed Papatūānuku, feed hini ahuone. Just don't feed the rubbish bin. That would be our number one message today, is to keep our kai out of the rubbish bin, because when it goes into the rubbish bin, it ends up in landfill. And green waste that goes into landfill causes methane. And methane is a gas that is causing the air temperature to rise. It adds to other waste products in landfill that make the poison leachate, a toxic fluid that is harmful to Papatūānuku. Hini ahuone, she is the atua of the domain of soil, the woman that Tāne formed using soil, or une. And deep under her soils, she has been making oil, gas, and coal, algae and plankton, compost to make natural gas, coal, and oil. Our oil reserves have been created since the last mass extinction over 65 million years ago. And we have already used half of that resource in the last 100 years, contributing to the imbalance that we live with today. Plastics are also made from oil. Decomposition of natural materials is part of what we as humans do when we eat. Composting and digestion are two often used methods of processing biodegradable materials, including organics, discarded as waste. Many think they are different methods, but both are processes that manage decomposition, carried out by biological organisms, transforming the materials through chemical reactions. Our microbiome have the task to break the food down into usable nutrients. In the illustration there, you'll see the microbiome in the intestinal region. So microbiome is bacteria, fungi, algae, protozoa. Trillions of these microbes live on our body and in our body. Our gut microbiome is made up of trillions of these microbes. The gut microbiome plays a very important role in your health by helping control digestion and benefiting your immune system and healthy brain function. The basic reason compost heaps heat up is because of the activity of the microorganisms that break down the organic matter in your compost and in your digestive system. So you may not have chooks, pigs or worms to feed, but by composting you could feed your food waste and organic waste in general to the millions and billions of microorganisms living in the soil, which make all our food production possible. By doing so, you are feeding, restoring and building hini ahuoni and protecting and nurturing her ability to provide for us. This is an introduction to the most commonly used methods for composting food and organic waste. Let's go through these now. The first is te mahi Wairākau matua, cold composting. It is the simplest and most basic form of composting. It is simply add organic materials as they become generated or become available. Keep adding to the pile without turning or adjusting it. In 6 months to a year, the bottom portion of the pile will be a rich compost that you can spread into your garden. Cold composting is usually in a container or an open frame. It can also be just a pile or a heap. In general, the rule, what goes in cold compost is anything made from a plant. Fruits, vegetables, paper, cardboard, as long as they're non-glossy. Glossy usually means there's synthetic glues, sometimes plastics, in the paper or cardboard. Garden waste, grass clippings. Meat and dairy is not ideal for cold composts as they will attract pests, for example, rats, mice, flies, and they may smell, especially if the compost is open and uncovered. Some of these foods could make your own animals sick as well. Breads, grains, and other baked, cooked, processed foods can go in. Best to bury or cover over to deter pests. They need a good mix of nitrogen, which is green, wet, and fresh material, and carbon, which is dry, brown, or dead material. So your nitrogens are your greens. A way to remember that is look at the last 3 letters in nitrogen. That word is close to greens. So nitrogen we find in our fresh kitchen waste, fresh animal manure, grass clippings, tree cuttings, vegetable waste, fruit. And carbons are our browns, and you can remember that in a similar way by looking at the last three letters in carbon, which is very close to brown. So the browns are dried plant and food waste, dry animal manure, soil, straw, sawdust, cardboard, paper, non-glossy. Te mahi Wairākau matua, cold compost systems vary. The common structure that we see here in the image is just using pellets. Cold compost is typically in some sort of structural or container. Sometimes people cover them to retain heat. Otherwise, they're often left open to the elements, air, water, sun. The general rule for what goes in cold compost is anything made from a plant. Fruits, veggies, paper, cardboard, garden waste, green clippings. They need a good mix of nitrogen, green, wet, fresh, and carbon, dry, brown, dead. This is an example of a 3-bay cold composting system, quite commonly seen around in different places. So what you can do here is just fill the bin on the left first, and when that's full, you can rake it into the middle one, and what happens then is the top material goes on the bottom and the bottom material is then on the top. So that helps to reverse the composting process and speeds up the decomposition. And then you can start filling that first left container again, and you can keep doing that across until the 3 bays are full. Something to remember about cold compost: meat and dairy are not ideal. Also, cold composting does not reach high temperatures, so you're not likely to kill the seeds in that system. And now, hot composting, te mahi Wairākau wera. This is the opposite to cold composting. When your compost reaches around 54 degrees Celsius, it's considered hot. At this temperature, the pile is hot enough to kill off most weeds, bugs, seeds, and harmful pathogens. Hot composts are maintained at higher temperatures, which can therefore safely compost all kinds of food waste: meat, dairy, breads, grains, baked and cooked foods. The heat is essential to killing harmful pathogenic bacteria, fungi, protozoa, worms, and other parasites, as well as weed seeds in the pile. Hot composting is an aerobic process, meaning that it uses oxygen. Microorganisms use heat to rapidly decompose organic waste. In contrast, cold composting is anaerobic, without oxygen. If it's not turned, then there's no oxygen within the pile. The oxygen in a cold compost is just from what's coming in from the outside and touching the edges. Hot composts require maintenance to maintain temperature, oxygen and moisture levels for the process to work correctly. You turn the pile regularly as part of this process. So in a hot compost, you can put all kinds of food waste, garden waste, lots of living carbon for the process to work, such as hay, wood chip, sawdust, dry carbon garden waste like wood, branches, twigs, which are better mulched up. Mulching does help the breakdown process to accelerate in the heat decline. Paper and cardboard, though possible to compost and are made from a plant, many hot composters do not want it in the mix for reasons of the quality of the compost that they're trying to create. As microorganisms digest the organic matter, the exothermic reaction heats up the pile. The compost pile itself acts like a blanket to keep the heat in and can quickly reach temperatures of 80 degrees Celsius combustion. Combustion, the burning of carbon-containing compounds, uses oxygen from air and produces carbon dioxide, water, and lots of heat. For example, combustion of methane, which is a wee bit counterproductive. If it's too hot, then we're releasing methane into the air. Some systems that I'm aware of cool the compost down if it reaches 70 degrees Celsius because of the methane release. Cooling down can be achieved by turning or watering. One of the main byproducts of microbial activity is heat. Microbial activity raises the temperature of a compost pile. The bacteria to begin the composting processes are the psychrophilic bacteria, which is active at 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If it goes above that, then different bacteria leap in to do the hard yards, and that's the mesophilic bacteria, which operate at 70, or actually I've got that, actually operate at 21 to 38 degrees Celsius is the mesophilic, whereas the psychrophilic is 10 to 21 degrees. If the conditions are good, there's plenty of oxygen, moisture, and nitrogen, which is our greens, the temperature continues to rise to the point where the thermophilic bacteria begin to operate. These can raise the temperature up to 60 degrees Celsius or more. How long it stays this high depends largely on its size. In a backyard pile, thermophilic bacteria can keep a pile between 54 and 70 degrees Celsius for several weeks, as long as it's periodically turned to introduce new oxygen. Big agricultural or municipal systems can reach higher temperatures and maintain them longer than backyard heaps, simply because they're larger. It takes the thermophilic bacteria longer to eat through them. The high surface area to volume ratio also favours high temperatures. A hot pile cools down when it has run out of fuel. The thermophilic bacteria can no longer find enough carbon to support them in the dense concentrations necessary to maintain the peak at its peak temperature, the pile at its peak temperature. One other observation about temperature needs to be included here. When temperatures in a pile drop below freezing, microbial activity stops. However, the alternation of freezing and thawing that occurs in many cold climates, climate piles, during the autumn and early spring will continue to break down materials physically. Here, students from Fraser High School in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, are turning the contents of this community compost system from the first bay into the second. Notice how they are adding water to correct the moisture levels. This is an example of a community compost hub, which is set up at the neighbouring community centre adjacent to the high school. It processes the school's food waste and distributes the rich compost through local community networks. And this system that you can see here is the same system, and they've placed 4 together so that they can go from one bin to the next. Hot composts work well in community settings where they can be shared by many. These systems cost more to set up. Where funding allows, a system like this could be scoped. Te mahi Wairākau wera, hot composting at extreme zero waste in Whaingaroa, Raglan. So this system is up at the old landfill at Whaingaroa, extreme waste in Raglan. It's a long concrete trench. It processes 3 tonnes of the town's food and other organic waste every week. And you can see the rich colour of that compost. Zero Waste sells the compost back as a quality product to the community where the food waste came from in the first place. The waste goes in one end and it's turned by a digger regularly and just moved to the right and slowly works its way down until it's complete. And they have the big lids there that you can see in the pictures that cover the system so that rodents can't get in, pests can't get in. And they can control the moisture level that way as well. So this is another hot composting system. So the Parakuri Cube compost is based on these hot compost principles. The enclosed box method can be left to go cold, although it will be slow to break down as no air is getting into it from the sides. So this view is looking into the hot compost box. A lid will go over the top of this to enable us to control the moisture levels. This example has been stacked with several layers of greens and browns that have caused it to become hot. It must be turned and watered regularly to allow air in that will feed the microorganisms, thus causing it to heat up. So I'm going to show you the layering method, which is like a lasagna. The image on the left is, you can see several layers there. And that's what the box looked like before the slats went in to close it in and the lid went on. So the lasagna type, it's a bit like making a lasagna pasta where you put sheets of pasta one on top of the other. You can do the same thing with composting, adding layers of browns and greens. Be sure to keep it moist and it will slowly break down as a cold compost if you just leave it, or you can turn it and water it regularly to make it heat up. So composts need that oxygen and they need that water to become hot. A square meter cube is ideally filled up as it will get hot quickly. It will get smaller as it decomposes and can be added to. The system there on the right, we've simply made a box out of corrugated iron, and we've used the lasagna method there as well. Built it up with different greens and browns, and then used the plastic cloth tarp over top to control the moisture levels, and that one is heating up. So the image here, this is a community mara in Masterton, which has many long beds. and the lasagna method of composting is working well for them. So they cover their entire beds with different layers of greens and browns. It can take a few seasons to create a rich soil bed, as composting needs to be a regular application, as the cropping does deplete the nutrients. I've noticed in my garden it's taken me 4 years to get a really good deep soil base. So the following is an example of layering a box all in one go. So on the right there you'll see some pea straw on the base, and then I've put lawn clippings in, and then horse manure, and then more grass clippings and some food waste, and then more horse manure. And I've continued to do that all the way through. There's probably about 10 different layers there. So doing it all in one at the same time. On day 2, I was watering it as I went as well, so that the water was well distributed through that those layers. Day 2, it reached 52 degrees, which is higher than my hot water system, which is set at 45 at the moment. And some people do use hot composting to heat their water, where they run piping through hot composting systems. And you'll see on day 3 it's reached 65 degrees. Yeah, so that's piping hot. So having a lid on helps the heat to build up and allows you to control the moisture levels by keeping that rain out. So this is a compost turner that Bunnings sell. I think they're around about $20. And it's about 1 meter long. And so you basically just screw it down into the compost. So you can see the handle there on the left, and then pull it up. And so what that does, it does start to mix the ingredients up, as well as it allows air down into that the deep parts of the composting. I also, as the levels drop, I add in more grass clippings and food and soil into the mix until it's properly full. So there in the image, I've pulled up the bottom layers, and you can see that worms have got in there. I find food disappears within about 3 weeks, and grass clippings as well. And the worms are normally in areas that are not too hot. So they don't like the really big heat that happens in the middle. They tend to be around the sides and down below. And other insects join in as well. So when the compost is done, it's ready to go on to the mara. And so what I've done here, I've already had a summer crop. I've gone in and just cut down the green that's left. So some of it's weed seeds that have come through, some of it's plants that I've harvested. I've left the roots in the ground, and I've started to put a layer of compost over the mara. And there you can see I've spread it out and I've planted into it. So this compost took about 3 or 4 months to be ready for the mara. And so there's my second summer crop. And it's only taken 4 or 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks at the most, to give me a whole new second summer crop. So we're moving on now to a rotational compost system. This is good for small whānau. You simply add your kai to it and turn it regularly. So it's good for a small family. There's 2 there, as you can see, and they spin independently. And if you're renting and you're sort of moving property, it's quite easy to take your compost with you. And that's what it looks like on the inside. Okay, te mahi pāmu noke, worm farming. So this particular worm farm is a New Zealand-made product. As you can see there, it's called the Hungry Bin. They can be purchased $349. It's a fantastic system. So worm farming is another method of composting, also known as vermiculture. It's the process of harnessing earthworms to convert organic waste into the most nutrient-rich fertilizer, worm manure. So worm farm fertilizer is far superior to chemical fertilizers, which contain pesticides and herbicides that burn the soil and kill beneficial microbes. Worm tea adds beneficial microbes, which puts nitrogen back into the soil, making it available for plants to absorb. It's a great way to regenerate your soils. Both the vermicast, the dark, rich worm manure created by the worm farm, and the drained liquid fertilizer can be used for plants, but more so as a soil conditioner, adding essential life to your soil. Worms are Papatūānuku's dedicated helpers. Worm farms always have a way of draining the liquid fertilizer, or worm tea, out of the bottom, and are always enclosed in containers. Worm farms are often set up in smaller, movable, non-permanent containers, which make them easily transportable. They also don't take up much space and can be kept in sheds, gardens, balconies, apartments and townhouses, or spaces with limited outdoor space. Worm farms can only process a certain volume of waste at a time to match the capability of the worms. So the size of the farm makes all the difference to how much green waste or kitchen waste you can put into it. So what goes in? Worm farms process only certain kinds of food waste, fruit and vegetables mostly. Foods to avoid are meat, seafood, dairy, breads, grains, cooked or oily food, citrus, and onions. The worms don't like those foods and usually won't touch them. Garden waste is not ideal for worm farms. Grass clippings, they can heat up and make it too warm for the noki. Worm farms need a good mix of nitrogen and carbon. Paper and cardboard work well in worm farms. They're a good bedding for the worms as it breaks down. And once again, just don't use anything that's glossy. Egg cartons are really good. So here's a close-up of my worm farm. So you can see there's quite a bit of activity in there. Lots of worms, a few other insects crawling around in there. So moisture is quite important too. Not too wet and not too dry. Worms are practically 70 to 80% water themselves, so they easily freeze and they easily dry up. Actually, Worms are like pets. The tiger worms thrive in ideal conditions, needing shelter from frost and intense sun. They can eat their own weight daily, and one can reproduce 200 times in 6 months. So one can become 200. Vermiculture is the quickest way to create compost. They are different to earthworms that only consume soil. So compost worms are tiger worms. They eat living organisms such as nematodes. Actually, I've just got a wee bit mixed up there. So the worms that we use for the nuke pāmu are tiger worms, which are vegetarians. So they're eating the vegetable matter, whereas earthworms consume soil. And in that soil, the earthworm will eat nematodes, protozoans, bacteria and fungi in the soil. And it's said that anything that grows out of soil, well, that soil has been through an earthworm. Some say that our human life is dependent on worms for what work the worms do to soil to create our powerful vegetables. So small helpings of vegetables and fruit, easy for them to consume. So I only put a couple of inches in terms of the layer on top, and they don't eat fresh. They tend to let it decompose a wee bit before they start eating. Worms have got very small mouths and no eyes. So the bottom tray is where the noke tutai, or the vermicastings, the poo, ends up. The noke burrow down to the bottom of the worm farm to do their tutai, their poo, their excrement. I guess this keeps it out of the food area. And to collect those, it's made easy for us with this particular model. We can just unclip it and take the vermicastings out. So here I've added those vermicastings to compost. So they really do help when you're composting, to put them into a compost pile. They're a rich source of microorganisms and can be added to increase the microbial activity in your compost pile. Vermicast, also called worm castings, worm humus or hummus, worm manure or worm feces, and is the end product of the breakdown of organic matter by earthworms. Adding vermicastings to water as food for plants. So each one of these buckets has got about a cup full of the vermicastings. This is a good way to share the nutrients to soil and plants, and it also helps to condition the soil. So I will select different plants to pour this diluted mixture onto. Usually plants that are beginning to fruit or beginning to mature, just to give them that last bit of nutrient. So these are two other models of pāmu noke worm farming. The one on the left you can purchase from Bunnings, so it's less than 1 metre high, and they say that can be kept indoors. And you'll see there's 4 different levels there. So the levels increase as the population of the worms increase. And the system on the right, which is a bigger system, that's probably over 1 metre high, that one, that's also got the different layers there too. So these are some options that are available as well. You can make your own worm farm using repurposed materials. Bathtubs work really well for worm farms as they already have the drain hole as part of their design. So you can see the drain hole, the bath down the bottom here, the drip tray underneath. And the moisture that comes out is really, it's just the moisture from what you've put into the worm farm. So sometimes I'm adding water to it, and that water is going down through the soil and coming out the bottom, picking up some of the vermicastings on the way. Laundry sinks are also easily adapted for worm farms. Visit your local resource recovery centre if you have one nearby. In-ground worm farm. So in-ground worm farms do not require castings to be harvested. Instead, the worms work in a sustainable system of delivering the castings directly into the surrounding soil. This not only fertilizes your plants, but it helps to keep your soil healthy and keep the soil aerated. So you'll see the diagram on the left where a hole's been dug. A bucket that's had holes drilled into the sides of it has been put into the ground, and you can see at the bottom there's a level for fruit and vegetable scraps and a worm blanket, which can even be cardboard. It's just to give an extra layer of protection to the worms, and they do like that darkness. And the image on the right there, you can see a bucket there that's been placed into the hole. So they obviously need the lid there as well. I haven't used this system myself, but apparently it works really well. The worms stay in the soil, they come in to get their kai, and they go back out again. Okay, so pokahi or bakashi. Bakashi is a Japanese word that means fermented organic matter. It is a bucket system, always closed, that uses an anaerobic process, meaning no oxygen, to ferment the food waste. It uses EMO, or effective microorganisms, in a bakashi bran, which is a separate product. The combination of the anaerobic process with the microorganisms ferments but does not break the food down. The bakashi bran work at their best in anaerobic conditions when there is no oxygen about. If the lid is left open, even just a crack, air can get into the composter and stop the beneficial microorganisms from working properly. The final essential step is to add the fermented food waste either into your compost system, hot or cold, your worm farm, or dig it directly into your garden, into the soil. Burying it in soil or compost completes the decomposition process. Because you are essentially composting in buckets, this method suits smaller spaces. You can easily make your own system. They don't take up much space. They don't smell. You can have them inside a garage, shed, covered area. It is a small-scale operation suitable more for homes or small organisations. You can't just use the bakashi buckets to process the food waste. You need access to compost or soil to transfer it into for the final stages. So what can you put into a bakashi? All kinds of food waste, including cooked foods, breads, grains, meat, seafood, and dairy products. They cannot take liquid food waste. Bakashi take 100% nitrogen waste, green, wet, fresh. Do not put carbon materials, dry, brown, in. No paper or cardboard. So there's two systems there that you can see. The one on the left is the one that you get from Bunnings, Mitre 10. It's two buckets that fit into each other. That top bucket lifts out and it has holes in the bottom where any fluid that comes out of the vegetable waste that goes into the top is able to drip out into the bottom bucket. And you must empty that bottom bucket every couple of days because otherwise it will get smelly. And when I say empty it, it's a great fertilizer. You can mix it 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 50 to 1, depending on what you're feeding in your garden. You can also pour it down the kitchen sink if you want to clean out the pipes. She's great stuff. The system on the right, you can see it's got a tap at the bottom. And so that tap does the same thing with the fluid. It gets that fluid out so that you can use it. So here you see the top bucket has got kai in there, and what you need to do with that kai, using that potato masher, which is quite a good tool to do it with, is you mix in this Bokashi bran. So it's about a tablespoon for every cup of kai that goes into these buckets. The bran is also sold at Bunnings and Mitre 10 in bags. It's reasonably priced. So mix that up with the food waste and it will ferment, making sure that the lid's on firmly each time you use it, because if it's not, oxygen will get in and it won't ferment. It will start to rot instead, which is not what you want, and that's when it gets smelly. It takes about 6 weeks to fully ferment vegetables using this method, and then it's ready for the garden. It can be dug into the soil, usually put in underneath. We'll get to some pictures on that. So there's the holes at the bottom of the top bucket. You can make your own Bokashi system. The bottom bucket is for the liquid to drain into. Notice the holes there. Make sure you have a lid that seals tightly, and therefore the smell won't come out even if it's indoors. Some extra tips re Bokashi. Maggots are not a problem in regards to the fermentation process of Bokashi, and they will die quickly inside the system due to the lack of oxygen and of their food source. Most people do not like the look nor the idea of maggots inside their Bokashi, so we here have some tips to keep maggots out. Don't allow food waste to sit out exposed. Use a lidded container to collect your food waste. Keep your buckets clean in between batches. Clean your bottom bucket after emptying the Bokashi juice from the bucket. Wipe clean any food or liquid spill on the outside of the buckets. Bokashi is a clean process, and by keeping it clean, you will have great success. I have a number of organisations that are using them, and they're doing really well with them. So it's all about just having the knowledge of how to use them correctly. So trench composting. This is simply burying your food waste in your garden beds. Generally speaking, you want to bury it somewhere you will not be planting for at least 2 to 3 months for it to completely break down into the soil. A more methodical approach would be rotating where you bury one season with where you plant the following. The term trench is used as some people dig long trenches between garden rows and pathways and compost in a long trench, which becomes the garden row in the following season. Make sure your carbon-rich materials, such as paper and dried leaves, are mixed thoroughly with your nitrogen-rich materials like vegetable scraps, kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, and fresh grass clippings before you bury them. Our next wānanga is going to cover that in depth, the nitrogen carbon use and the science of that. Avoid putting in too much woody material, sticks, branches, as they take longer to decompose and will rob your soil of nitrogen in the process. So what goes into a trench? Any kind of food and any volume of food can be buried using this system. Meat, dairy, and seafood can be buried, but make sure it is deep enough to not attract animals. It is still good to mix it up with carbon, dry, brown, dead materials, mixed up, not layered. Bokashi and trench composting go together nicely. Bokashi does the initial stages by fermenting it and breaking it down, and burying it does the rest. So here's an example of an illustration showing trench compost. So you can see where you bury the excess plant waste in your garden under several inches of soil. You may plant into these areas after 2 or 3 months. And it doesn't have to be in a trench. It could be just a hole in the ground in a garden where you will plant in the future. So purchasing compost. Purchasing compost. I've got an example there of the Awapuni, which is Palmerston North. It's the old tip site, which is no longer used as a tip site. It's all now for recycling and for making compost. They have several great big long mountains of compost going at any one time, probably 3 meters high by 3 meters wide. And you can see the big digger there on the left that they use for turning that compost. So their compost is made by mixing horse manure, green waste, and kitchen food waste. It takes 3 months to mature and is turned every few weeks. It's sold at $30 per square meter, so it's actually a really good value. The cool thing about purchasing from a place like this is that you can take a trailer, buy it in bulk. It's a lot cheaper than buying the bagged compost that you'll find at some of the bigger outlets. Some of that bagged compost, the cheaper stuff, that's $4 or $5 a bag. My understanding is that it's not composted naturally like it is here. It's actually cooked in furnaces. So it hasn't quite got the microbia element in it that you get when you're hot composting. So at that same site, the council take the sludge from the sewage ponds, and they also build mountains of that, long mountains of this sludge, and they mix that with green waste and horse manure to break it down, and then they spread it out off the side of the tip site there. So it's not used as a compost as such, but it has decomposed and eventually will go back to nature. So just briefly now, getting to the end of our talk, I just wanted to show you some examples where that purchased compost has been used with some of our kōhanga. So this example here, where they've made long, thin gardens, pretty much what's happened here is there's been a thick layer of wood mulch, about 6 inches thick, that's gone down first, and then they've created gardens within the wood mulch using the purchased compost. One of the benefits, no seeds, so there's no weeding to do. It's quite easy to do, and the wood chip keeps the moisture and the worms happy. So these gardens don't dry up like some gardens do. So this kōhanga has got 16 of these 2-metre circular mara beds, and they purchase their compost locally and use a trailer as well. So each bed is surrounded by wood chip, as you can see, helping to retain the moisture in the mara. And it becomes a breeding ground for those nuki as well. That's at the same kōhanga. So this is another system where I've just cut a 2-metre circle out on my back lawn. That's about 200 millimeters deep, and the idea here is to put purchased compost straight into this mara. I wanted to have the garden going by the end of the day. It took about 4 hours to turn into this, with plants growing in it, and the bricks around just helps with the mowing and keeping it tidy. And that was done just at the early summer, and within about 5 weeks I was eating the produce from it, just this produce in here. The other produce here has come out of the garden, my bigger garden, that is. So that's another system that you can use if you haven't got access to space where you can make a lot of compost. And compost does take time to make. You can, purchase quality compost, preferably in bulk, from councils that pretty much give it away. So here I've just cut out the front section of my mara and done the same thing again, where I've just put soil in, purchased soil in around the edges there, and that's about probably 8 weeks of growth there to get it to that stage where it's producing. And I do find covering with an anti-insect cloth does make a difference. It's kept the white butterfly down and hardly any caterpillars this year. And I think the great thing, what I've noticed using compost, is that there's far less snails and slugs. I'm hardly seeing snails and slugs. I'm not sure why that is, but that's what seems to be happening in my garden. So this is our local community garden, and it's a great place to experiment. So you'll see on the image on the right there, these are the bins for cold composting. And what we've decided to do is to turn one of these into a hot compost. So just by raking over some of this material that's already partially decomposed, it's just waste out of the garden, mixing it with horse manure, lawn clippings as well, we quite quickly made that into a hot compost. Even though it's got air coming in through the sides, it is heating up. It's got black polythene over top as well. So I find composting is constant experimentation. There's no right or wrong way of doing this, and the compost will teach you and lead you to where it wants to go. So what we're going to do now is a bit of a test, and I'm going to ask you to name what sort of composting system that you're looking at here, and just to put the answer in the chat. So if you can have a go at that now, just write down what sort of compost system this is in the slide. Right, going to the next slide. What sort of compost system is this?
Kia ora, Ihoa, we can see your speaker notes in the answer.
Oh, okay. I hope you couldn't see my speaker notes through the whole thing.
We did, but it was almost like it was captioned, so it's okay. But just for this, we can see the answer.
Oh, okay. So you've been looking at little images. I thought you'd be looking at big ones. Sorry about that. Okay, so the answers are there. I'm not sure what to do about that. I think I can do no. Okay. Well, let's not get too concerned about that. So there we have Bokashi and trench composting. So that one's just digging the hole. And that one there is the Nuki Pamu again. And the cold compost. Bokashi, doing it yourself, finding your own containers. And if you do that, just make sure that when the containers fit into each other, that it is sealed. It's got to be a good seal. So it normally needs a lip around the top, a lip like that. Cold compost. Hot compost at extreme waste. Trench composting. So we have some questions here. And we just want to hop into some breakout rooms, groups of 3 or 4 people to cover the reflection questions. So these are the questions. What surprised you in this talk? What is your main takeaway learning from this wānanga? And what are your next steps? I hope that was helpful, the feedback session there that you've had. I think what we're doing now is looking. Test yourself. Okay. Yeah, so we've got 16 minutes left. Is there... Yeah, we've got questions and answers that have come in. So if you're happy for me to jump over to that, we can have a look at some of those questions now. So the first question is from Fagan. Do the dried brown plants need to have been mature first to be considered a good source of carbon? Yeah, so dried brown is the carbon. So sometimes what I will do is leave leaves out for them to dry up to get ready for carbon. So if you've got a storage area where you can put leaf mulch and those sorts of things, just letting them dry out is a good source of carbon. From Maury, I have been only using pellets that are labelled HT to indicate they have been heat treated. Do you have any thoughts on this? Would you recommend avoiding pellets that are labelled MB? Yeah, so you've got noted here, MB means methyl bromide treated. So I think the safest thing to do is when you come across a pellet that you might be able to use, you will find a label on it somewhere. Google that label, because there are a few that are untreated and are safe, but you need to hunt for them. So I'm also careful using hangi. In hangi too often pellets are used, but we need to check that they're safe as well, that they haven't got chemicals in them. So yeah, I tend to like to keep chemicals well away from the mara. Emma has asked, how regular is the turning for hot composting? So that depends on the size of the compost. The small 1 metre box system that I showed you, what I do is I just watch the temperature, and when it comes down under say 40, I'll then get in with my compost turner and get in there and get some more oxygen in there, check the water levels. It might need some more water as well, and then it will come back up again. So yeah, it depends on the size. I think the big ones that the council do, that get really hot, they have to turn quite regularly so that they're not too hot. Eugene has asked, so instead of putting my compost directly in soil, I should put it through a bokashi first? No, you can. Yeah, so when you say compost, I'm imagining you're saying your kitchen waste. Yeah, so your kitchen waste can go directly into the soil. It can be dug down deep. So, a couple of 100 millimeters deep at least. Deeper if it's meat or something that animals are going to get into. You can put anything into your bokashi. So if you're going to do the bokashi system, you do it thoroughly. You may need a 2-bin system because it takes 6 weeks to fully do the bokashi. So the last kai that you put into the bokashi is still going to take 6 weeks. So that's when you put the lid on it, take it out into the shed and leave it there for 6 weeks. And having a second backup system means you can just keep going with it. And those bins, now that you can see me, I've got some samples here. So there's one there. And so I get these for $5 each at a bakery. Okay. And you might be able to see I've drilled some holes in the bottom just using a drill. Oh no, that's the bottom bin. There's the top bin there, and you'll see holes in the bottom. So that's a $10 system, this one. And it's got that wonderful lid there to keep it sealed up. So that's what you look for, is that lid. You don't want buckets that are going to jam into each other, because you'll never get them off when they're full of kai. Fagan, why do thermophilic bacteria take longer to break things down when they operate at higher temperatures? Yeah, so I'm not really up on the science of that. So you might have to do your own research there. All I know is that different bacteria comes in at different times, depending on what the temperature is. What were those things floating at the top of the 3 buckets? Yeah, so they were some whitefly that were in the nuke pamu. So the nuke pamu attracts all manner of insects. One way to keep it clean is to add lime. So a handful of lime every couple of months will make the system more alkaline. It's when it's too acidic and that's why we keep things like lemons and oranges out of it, that you attract unwanted insects in there. Tony has asked, do you recommend the best place to buy tiger worms in Wellington? Local person to support, just go to the big guys, Bunnings, etc. Yeah, so Bunnings do sell those worms. They're quite expensive. I think it's like $50 for 1,000. If you join a local community garden, you may find someone who's got a worm farm. Yeah, so my one produces so many worms that I've always got excess worms. So it's quite easy for me to help start another person off just by giving them some of mine. And I usually give like half an ice cream container full of worms to get someone started, because you want 500 to 1,000 to get off to a good start. Monique has asked, should you turn dig in your worm farm or leave them undisturbed? Yeah, that's a good question, because what happens over time is that the soil in the worm farm gets quite compressed because of the weight. And I think that makes it harder for the worms to go down to do their business and come back up again. So what I do is probably every 6 months, I just mix in a bit of straw, a bit of peat straw into that soil. And sometimes I'll tip everything out of the worm farm just onto a big tarp, and which is a good exercise because you really get to see how many worms are in there. And then I reload it, mixing it with straw. And that straw helps create that alkaline environment too, which is ideal for nuki. Yeah, and they love it after it's had a good clean. So that's all the questions that I've got at the moment. That's good. We're sort of going to time really well. We're going to send you a recording via email of this session if you want to revisit or send it out to someone else. So that will be by the end of the week. We've got another kaiarahi, Holly, who's going to be hosting our third online compost event, where she'll be talking more about the nitrogen and carbon. So that's on March the 23rd. So you're welcome to join in with that event. Yeah, so we can close up now with our karakia.